Hello, and welcome to the DEI is podcast. This is your host and community engagement lead to Diverity's Consultant Network, Enrico Imanalo, coming to you live from the Bay Area. The DEI is podcast is written and created by DEI practitioners for DEI practitioners and the organizations that look for them. If you need help with your people and culture problems, come check us out at diverity.com to see if we're the community you're looking for. So, embracing discomfort is something DEI practitioners often advocate, but what does that really look like in practice? Sometimes it looks like managing our own emotions, and other times it looks like calling something what it is. Often, that thing is called racism. As many of us in the Diversity Consultant Network are independent people and culture practitioners, and more specifically, DEI professionals, it's expected, at least on paper, that we will call out whiteness and racism when we see it. That said, as independent practitioners external to the organizations we provide services to, we often have to navigate the line between speaking truth to power and making sure that we get paid. So, how do we name whiteness in white spaces and make sure that we're successful? Here today to talk about that very thing are Dr. Nadejda I. Webb, Clarissa Fuselier, and Jess MacFarlane. How are you all doing?
Good.
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think first, before we jump into our questions, we are going to pivot to the audience. So, the first one for all y'all today is, where do you expect to run into whiteness? All right, so I'll leave that up as we're getting started here. But to our panelists, I think last month many people were aware that Uber's chief diversity officer, Bo Young Lee, was in the news regarding a pair of events, one in April and one in May, billed as, quote, diving into the spectrum of the American white woman's experience, titled Don't Call Me Karen. Reportedly, workers at Uber felt like they were being lectured on difficulties experienced by white women, specifically harms caused by the use of the term Karen, which usually refers to strongly entitled middle aged white women, and that the events work to minimize racism and the harms that white people can inflict on BIPOC. I'd like to get your take on that story, but to position us to do that, perhaps we can first get a definition of whiteness.
Yeah, so I would say let's kind of level set when we're having the context of this discussion of what we mean by whiteness, right? It could be misconstrued in so many different ways, but what I tell people is that whiteness is not a race, it's not an ethnicity, it is a category. It is a way to define who is allowed privilege, who's allowed resources, who's allowed the benefit of the doubt. And that is rampant throughout our entire society because anti-blackness, like whiteness runs on anti-blackness. It supercharges and fuels it, right? And so when we talk about whiteness, anyone can perpetuate whiteness. They can be an agent of whiteness. They can be in a proximity to whiteness. But it is one of those things that we would say that in our society, it is very well known that whiteness is the default. It is the thing that we don't even think about its value. When we think about American, we kind of think white. Everything else has a hyphen, before it. So that's what I say in a nutshell, that whiteness is a category. It is a culture of things around privilege and oppression and who gets what.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so if we're pivoting more to the situation that happened at Uber, I mean, anybody got any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we have to interrogate their choice to center that narrative for their workers, right? Because that's what was happening. They chose to have a talk, and that's what they chose to interrogate. And the question again is, why would you choose to interrogate this specific thing, as opposed to the experiences, perhaps of like the I'm not sure about the workforce. I would make an assumption that it's probably majority white, and so why wouldn't you choose to at least the corporate workforce, why wouldn't you choose to interrogate experiences of the non-majority to
Hmm.
bring sort of like a different experience, to highlight something more? I think our collective imagination, we can tell you, I am not a white woman. I can tell you about the experiences of white women. They're they're mediated. They're everywhere. So I think that's a fruitful starting point. Well, why would we make this specific decision, and what were we aiming to do? What were we aiming to what sort of experience were we aiming to facilitate for the folks in the audience? And I'm not entirely sure, given the pushback, that they thought about the experiences that, like the experience that they were
Mhm.
facilitating. And that may be, the core of the issue, right? Because whiteness also, a part of that is what we consider, what would be the traditional. And so,
Mhm.
was that traditional within that workplace? And did they just make a choice that falls within that category as opposed to interrogating it and saying, well, perhaps even though this is something that we would have traditionally done or we have done in the past, given this specific moment, given, Black Lives Matter, given all of the things that have happened within the last few years, we have to do something different. And why did they choose to do something different?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Great points. I mean, Jess, you do a lot of work around white allyship. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd just be curious to get your perspective here.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I would say, um, I'm deciding kind of where I want to go from here. But what I'm thinking about is I don't know a lot of details about what was contained in the Uber session, and especially kind of where this fell in their journey around equity work internally, right? But I'm thinking about there can be useful conversations in cohorts of white people led by a white facilitator or a facilitator of any race, to be honest, focused on kind of how whiteness shows up within us and what gets in the way. So that can be fruitful work. If I were doing that, I don't think that I would call it "Don't Call Me Karen." I don't know that that's a really kind of like helpful way to enter the conversation, because in my experience, that kind of title is going to kick up defensiveness immediately. So folks are going to come into the room with kind of preconceived ideas, with worries about how they're going to be perceived or that they're going to be called Karen, things like that, right? So again, I don't know the details there, but I do want to name that I think it can be helpful in our unlearning of whiteness to really talk about how does whiteness show up for us as white people, because so many of us don't even see it, right? We are all, we've lived it and breathed it so long that we're not aware until someone kind of presents it to us like a mirror. So there can be fruitful space for that.
And that's a great segue. So, our follow up question here is, as DEI professionals, why is it important to name whiteness in white spaces, especially when people are paying for our services?
So I can kind of kickstart that. So I I predominantly feel that for us in this space, there is a firm line of integrity that we must hold. And our duty, and I actually have it on my website because I don't want any of my potential clients or anyone to get it twisted of how I approach my work. But my thing is I tell them is you may sign my check, but I don't work for you. I work for your employees. I'm here to service them. And that is what you're hiring me for. And then I also say, if I'm going to tell it like it is, if you have a white supremacy problem, I'm going to name it. If you have a lack of resources, I am going to call it out. I feel like those are the things that, like, we are in this capitalist society that forces us to use this thing of like we have to get paid, and that's true. We have bills to pay, but I also want to be able to look at myself in the mirror every morning and be
Mm,
able to say, as a DEI practitioner, my duty is a people-oriented social justice work. My duty is to helping the communities that are marginalized. And if my work is not doing that, if I'm not accurately calling out whiteness when I see it, and how to, mitigate and dismantle that, then what am I doing besides picking up a check? And then I'm just part of the problem.
Mhm. Yeah.
mm,
Thank you for that, Chloe. I think that gets us to what it means to make change, what it means to be a change maker. And I think that also gets us to thinking about like DEI as a corporate practice, or even the name, DEI, that it has been pulled into, like, actually as a corporation, we'll bring a practitioner in, and that in itself is the change. And it's like,
Mhm.
actually, is that the change? And if we don't name something, how can we actually unpack it? How can we actually say, well, actually, this is the problem. There is a problem. We have to be able to very clearly and specifically name what's happening to get to the root, to, you know, to capture experience, not capture, I don't want to use that word, but to name the experiences, as you said, of employees, you know, to get to their experiences. What are the things that they're facing day to day in this work environment? So I think in order to make change, it is critically necessary to not even just to, it's, you know, we're talking about speaking truths power, we started with that, but it's critically necessary not just to name it, but to get specific, to be thorough. And yes, to engage with the experiences of employees, because they're the ones who have to stay in this work environment after we leave. So what is the purpose of the work if something about that doesn't shift, or if we don't plant a seed that can then be watered to produce further change? And I think that's the other aspect of this, right? You can't, change is a long-term thing. And I think sometimes folks bring in a practitioner and they think, hey, the practitioner's here, we're going to have these sessions, and bam. Actually, that's not the way that works. You're looking at a long-term project, a long-term journey to figuring out, you know, to really sussing out what is framing the violence that's here. And I think that's the other thing about naming whiteness. We're naming violence. And it's something that, you know, sometimes kills people. It shows up in bodies, right? And it's like, well, how do we resolve something? How do we start that journey? How do we get to the root if we're not willing to name? In the naming is in some ways a confrontation with the problem. And that's the power in the naming, right? There's power in language. And I think that's the power that's there. And that is something that we're tapping into when we're willing to do that work or start doing the work. Because again, it's a beginning, it's a journey.
Yeah. And I love that you're bringing up, Dr. Webb, the idea of, you know, organizations getting a consultant to come in, and they can often be very focused on the deliverables. Like, okay, we're going to do this assessment, we're going to do these workshops, you know. And for me, whiteness really shows up in like the in-between. Just how do they, you know, treat each other over email, or kind of who's seen as the norm within the organization. And I'm thinking about a client that I had. I'm going to be vague, but they're basically a community wellness organization. So small staff, but they had a lot of folks who come and use the space. And so we did an assessment of sort of the experience of folks who come into the space and why they're attending or not attending. And this organization had kind of done all the right things, right? They had affinity spaces for folks based on race and sexual identity and age. And they brought on a consultant, and they try to diversify the folks who are leading the classes. And, you know, there are all these boxes that you could check. And yet there was like tension within the community, right? Or they were having trouble with retention of people with different racial backgrounds, sexual identity, gender identity. And so through the assessment process, that was really what it came down to, was a really big finding. You can do all these other things that are like check the box, you know, increase diversity in your marketing, or, you know, make the space more physically accessible, things like that. But just the stories that we heard was this undertone of sort of who is seen as normal, quote unquote, who is seen as the folks who belong in the space and who's not, right? So everyday experiences of microaggressions, that community members were experiencing, or just these other kind of less like big ticket items, that it was just sort of the culture that you could feel within the organization. And so that was something that we had to reflect back to them. And I think it was difficult for the leadership, who were predominantly white, to take it in, because for them, that's like our everyday of how we operate, you know, not really recognizing, like, if we're not directly experiencing microaggressions, we don't know that, you know, those harms are happening necessarily. So yeah, I'm trying to think of like a useful metaphor around it, but I just feel like there's the, you know, the tasks, like the clients can be very focused on the tasks that you want to get done, but you have to really talk about like, what's the air, what's the culture, what's the energy of how things are happening within the space.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, jump in.
I think to your point, I think that's the naming white supremacy and naming the fact that we live in the wake of slavery and the aftermath of slavery, right? A both and when we are able to say, actually, these things construct our society and they construct the interactions that we're having, right? Then I think it brings a necessary confrontation, but also a necessary, like a new layer. And I say new because that's something that I think a lot of folks want to postpone or push back, put it somewhere else. It's not in the present, it's in the past, even though it impregnates the present. This is what we're facing right now. And how do we have a conversation if we don't want to name those things, if we don't want to say white supremacy, and if we don't want to say, actually, how are these small things then tied back to this major structure that is here? It's very much in the room. It's your neighbor. It sits right next to you.
That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, Dr. Webb, like you mentioned slavery, that was partly an issue of framing people as products, right? And that's often what happens to DEI practitioners, right? So, oh, you're a change agent. What I'm buying from you is change. I better be able to take it out of the box and open it up, follow the instructions, and it should be done like a TV dinner. And if it's not, you're bad at what you do. So it's like kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of dance. And if we can't, again, acknowledge what's wrong, then are we ever going to really get to dealing with it? We got a couple comments rolling in here. Abbiola Ballah, who some of you will remember from last month. Hey, Abbiola. Abbiola says, whiteness shows up in all aspects of our lives, in my opinion, from perfectionist tendencies in our work to how we code switch in certain spaces to seem more, quote, professional to our education system, and just how we show up in our daily lives.
I love the air quotes.
Necessary, right? Let's see, we got something in from Anderson. Acknowledging whiteness as an output culture today from a history of colonialism and slavery that reflects in a difficulty to embrace our full identities is a key point to move forward from diversity friction to real inclusion acts. May I ask the panelists to share best practices to create safe spaces and conflict resolutions for peace? Big question. Who'd like to dive in?
I have a thought right off the bat. Just one idea that's been useful for some of my clients is giving a framework for how we enter conversations. So two examples is having some like community agreements or kind of guidelines for how we're going to be in conversation with one another. So that could be things like, listen to understand, not to respond, because we can kind of be on the edge of our seats to wanting to respond to what other people are saying, and rather being in a position of let me take in what they have to say before just focusing on responding. Another one can be accepting that everyone's in a different place with our understanding of the content, and that's okay. We don't need to judge people for where they are, and we can recognize that people are at a different place and we're coming together around doing this work. So that can be helpful. We can also get really specific. There's a wonderful facilitator I've worked with who offers a nonviolent communication framework to her clients. And so saying, this is how we're going to name the issues that we're experiencing. And so nonviolent communication includes kind of your observation of what's happening, how you feel about it, what is a need that you have, and then what's a request. And so when we have given that framework to clients, it can be really helpful to get clear on like, this is how this is impacting me, and this is what I need from you. And it just kind of gives everyone a supportive way to engage in conversation with each other, because, as adults, many of us haven't been taught how to navigate conflict effectively. So having kind of guidelines can be helpful.
I think for me, I would ask the question, safe space for whom?
Mm.
And I resist giving like a full, I resist giving like a suggestion or like a complete answer, because I think so much of this also, apart from safe space for whom, some of this also depends on how this workplace functions in its specific iteration of the thing. What are the specific issues that are happening within this workplace? Because there are particular tensions that shape, right, the communication styles, particular people, events that we may not be cognizant of when folks say, well, we really want like a peaceful, like some sort of peaceful communication strategy. Well, why is there no peace to begin with? Was there some sort of preemptive action that was taken? Is there some violence that has already taken place that the employees are fully aware of, or that has like one employee, it has happened to me, I'm a witness to it, something like this, and that is the thing that's also there. So I think this is really this is specific to each. This is specific to the workplace, the work environment, the specific relationships that are there, the things that have happened. I really think this is context specific. I think is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. And I agree with everyone on the panel about the need to when I am actually trying to facilitate a space, and I don't call them safe spaces, I call them brave spaces because we're going to do real talk. And to Justice and Dr. Webb's point, not all of us really know how to deal with conflict resolution very well. That's the problem in corporate right now, is that everyone is very conflict averse. Everything that we can try to avoid confrontation, we're going to do it. And what's more confrontational than talking about whiteness in white spaces, right? People are going to try to avoid that at all costs. And what they're going to would be tempted to do is what happened at Uber and try to shift the comfort to whiteness, because we don't want their feelings to get hurt. We don't want anybody to be upset. And that is where we come in to make sure, like, like Dr. Webb said, safe space for who? Who are we trying to make this space safe for? We're trying to do it for everyone. And then also when we're creating these community agreements, are we doing it as a group? Like,
Right.
it's
As a
this work is people oriented. I can't say it enough. Everything that we've learned, even what Jess had mentioned in her story, is that you can't find these things by doing the standardized assessments and things like that. Maybe you could, but this is a culture. Whiteness is a culture in a category. So when you're talking to people, when you're having focus groups, when you're meeting with people in the office, when you're talking about them, of like how they feel, what's going on, looking around at the culture of things, seeing how people interact with one another, that is how you spot that stuff. That is how you build community, by listening to the people. And when this whole situation came up, the first thing that popped in my head really was so Lily Zing had wrote an article back in December talking about the DEI industrial complex. And it just rang pretty true of we will get into a space, if we're not careful, especially for DEI practitioners, to just go and just do the status quo. We're starting to do the same thing that we've been brought in to prevent.
Yeah.
So you have to always check yourself on that, and like, why am I here? Why am I getting this check for? It's supposed to be to make sure that this workplace is being fair and equitable to the people, to the employees there. So am I making this space safe for them? Because we know that they're the ones who have often marginalized. Is it safe for them? Can I hear from them? Because my first question with the whole thing kind of fell apart with Uber is like, did she talk to the people? Like,
Right.
I feel like that was a big miss, right? Because if you're not doing this people-centered work by talking to the people, then you're subjecting yourself to the DEI industrial complex.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So you are right. And everyone, not many people do have a background in conflict resolution. I happen to, and that's how I know that there's not that many people out there with it. But what I can say is within the conflict field, we talk about safe spaces, yes, but we talk more about brave spaces. That is, spaces that are safe enough, because people have a tendency to not really recognize what is safe versus what is comfortable.
Yeah.
And so when they're comfortable, they feel like they're safe, right? But you can be safe and uncomfortable. And that's the space that we really want to enter into, because that's where change tends to happen. And Anderson, I'm really glad that you used the word peace here. So part of my view is that peace is something that is an active process. It is not a ceasefire. It is not a chill in communications. It is something that people are proactively working for collectively for our mutual benefit, right? The other thing to keep in mind is to do that, we're right. We have to keep people at the center of that. And we can do that by leading with curiosity. People sometimes hear me say that and think that I mean to lead with questions or questioning, but that can also be a form of attack, right? So if you are asking earnest questions and you're really actually curious about why somebody thinks some way or why they are behaving in a certain way, well, humans are great at picking up on one another's mental states, and that will come through, right? That curiosity is not you trying to find some way to get something over on someone. People are really sensitive to that, right? So if you're centering people, if you're keeping them safe, not necessarily comfortable, you're leading with curiosity, and you are leveraging any kind of relationship that you have. Relationships are really important to conflict resolution, because if you don't have a relationship, why even bother engaging with conflict to begin with? You know, it just takes away from you. That's not productive conflict. That's destructive conflict. So thank you all for allowing us to spend a little time on that. We do have another question that I would love to get to. It's from another, member of the Diversity Consultant Network. Sinyi is chiming in here. Hello, Sinyi. She's saying, happy to make it to share space with accomplices / comrades / folks today. I would like to seek advice. How do people from marginalized communities in this work take care of themselves, especially in predominantly white spaces that are hostile and microaggressive?
Anybody want to start? All right, I'll take it, and everybody else can jump in. This is a really great question, and I think I see another individual that had a question pretty similar to this too. And this is important, right? We are taking on a lot of emotional labor when we do this work. I hear things, I talk about things that, it used to be a point where I would do work for some of my clients, and like after that I wouldn't be able to eat the rest of the day, and I wouldn't know what that was from, and it was because I was just emotionally spent. I was emotionally drained, and my body was just like, you can't do anything right now but like go to sleep and like try to recharge. So mental health for us is super important. In fact, it is a lot of reason why so many DEI practitioners in-house and out are burnt out. One is because, like we know, this is an uphill battle. So that stamina, you're not having that stamina or having to continue to generate that stamina can get very tiresome for all of us. And we get tired. And if, we're not seeing change, that can frustrate us. And then also just dealing with the trauma, like all of us, especially those who are doing this work that are from marginalized communities, or still have trauma that we're working out ourselves, right? And so, like I tell all of the practitioners that I talk to and work with, is that you have to take care of yourself first. Put your own mask on first, and make sure that you are practicing self-care. And so things like self-care, like I tell people, it's not always taking bubble baths and getting your nails done, even though that's dope, right? But things like that is, if you need to journal to process some of the things that you had to take in, do that. If you have access to a therapist or a life coach, do that. If there's lots of communities that are starting to sprout up in the DEI space that are being like little havens and, little small spaces that where we can be ourselves and kind of like release, and also find ways to connect and share something healthy with ourselves and have a space. Lisa Hurley and Elizabeth Leba had just released a space for specifically Black women called The Great Exhale. There is Crystal Johnson, who calls herself the DEI coach. She does different retreats. So my advice is, like, one of the things you want to do is try to find a community that, where you can be yourself, where you can kind of de-stress, find some things to take care of yourself first, because you can't do this work if you're burnt out. You just can't.
I think I would also add, and thank you for those suggestions. I think those are awesome. And I think you're right. I think my other suggestion would be that you have to monitor your commitments. You have to monitor the organizations that you choose to work with. Because to your point about emotional labor, right? If that organization is not, they're either funding or, a variety of other factors, they're not equipped to do the work that they say they're doing, but you're doing the work, you're going to be doing the heavy lifting. Is it really, indeed, you are here to facilitate a process, to seed a journey, sometimes to support someone or support the organization in a specific, specific leg of the journey, depending on what you're being brought on to do. But are you here to do all of the heavy lifting? You are not.
Yeah.
And especially when you are from a marginalized community and you do have your own commitments, right? Like I have this commitment. I would like to make change. I want to see it. I want it to be effective. But if I'm working with an organization who does not have the same level of commitment,
Yeah.
that is a dangerous space for me.
Mhm.
And I think just being aware of the commitments and of, just monitoring this, being cognizant, is also can be either the front line of defense or an additional line of defense that can be useful.
Mm.
That is perfect. Sorry, just well, one thing before I lose my thought, is that is the part that I saw someone that said that a lot of times we are brought in not to really do real change, but to for
Mhm.
optics. And that you hit the nail right on the head, Dr. Webb,
Mhm.
about that is that if you are not in-house, if you're a consultant like us, you need to vet your client. You need to vet your process, your prospects. And for me, like, yeah, I need a paycheck, but once again, that nuance that we're in this society, I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror every day.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to like waste my time with a client who just wants to use me for optics. That's not my thing. And so, get to your point where you can vet your clients and find out really like the why. I always ask any prospect that reach out to me, why are you reaching out to me today? Why do you feel that you need to engage a DEI consultant? And I will dig in until I find out like the meat of what they're really looking for. And sometimes they're just looking for someone to do like a couple of workshops for them. Like, nope, I'm sorry, I am not the one for that. Like, I will do assessments and I can't just throw some kind of standard out of the package box for you to, do a thumbs up for. And that's the thing that does mess with our mental health is working with clients that are toxic and feeling like we have to get that paycheck to do that. And like, at what cost?
Yeah. And I was just going to add, I don't have recommendations for speaking directly to BIPOC folks. I thank you both for sharing what you shared. I'm thinking about the white folks within institutions who have the power to create conditions with institutions, or maybe they're hiring consultants. So having heard what Chloe and Dr. Webb shared, I'm thinking about if you're part of that hiring for a consultant, increase the budget, right? Pay Black and brown practitioners more, so they can potentially, have fewer clients and have more space and rest so that they can be rejuvenated to do the work. And if you are able to make changes within the institution about, for instance, like benefits, like having just no questions asked mental health days available. I've seen that pop up a little bit more. Or do your healthcare benefits cover, can folks get access to mental health resources? Do you actually even have mental health resources within your own organization, like bringing folks in that people can turn to? Do you have affinity spaces and recognize that that is a place for folks to just like release, and be with one another and be in community? So things like that. I think it's hard to, or I would hope that people wouldn't hear the challenge and the pain that you all shared and just think, oh, well, it's on BIPOC folks to figure that out, right? No, it's not. We can shift the structures and the ways that our institutions are showing up so that people aren't so burnt out and, kind of hitting against the wall over and over.
Yeah, that burnout really is a bear. So anything we can do to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for that, I think is super, super important. There are lots of great comments. We'll get to more in a little bit, but for now, we'll pivot back to our questions here. So just to drive the point home, what happens if we don't name whiteness in white spaces?
The hard answer?
Give it to me.
We're complicit in violence.
Yep.
We are complicit in violence. And I think, back to naming in the wake and the aftermath of slavery, a white supremacist nation. Like literally, we function in a space that is structured by white supremacy. And if we're not willing to name this and to call it out, we are complicit in the violence, in the, the macro aggressions, in the things that are being faced by workers, by employees, by the folks that we are being brought in to support. And I think that's what's at stake, right? And if, there's been research about racism, the impact of racism on the body, and I can cite this directly. Cancer, people get sick, they get physically ill. Birth. If my mother was an immigrant and she gave birth here, I grew up in this society as a Black brown person, the weight of my child at birth will be less than my birth weight because of what I have been subjected to here. So there's something is critically at risk. A variety of things are critically at risk. And I think, because sometimes folks are being brought into organizations to do something that is very detached from that, you can lose sight of that actually something is at risk here. Folks are at risk here. Health is at risk here. People this is violence. And I think that must be held. It has to be held. It has to be reckoned with. It has to be named.
So, Dr. Webb, can I perhaps jump in for a moment? Listeners out there might be hearing you use the word violence again and again and again. So I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about what you mean by violence, because I'm pretty sure I have a good idea of it. And the thing about when we dive into some of the academic literature on violence, it challenges us to redefine violence and not arbitrarily, right? So people think of violence as the interpersonal action, but the academic take on it takes a closer look on what violence does, right? Like what the impact is and what that means. So if you wouldn't mind a little bit.
Okay, so I think I can get to some of this because I'm not entirely sure what articles you're gesturing to. I can't get as specific. But I think for me, anyway, I'm talking about, yes, the interpersonal, but also the aftermath of the interpersonal dynamics, right? If I face a microaggression in my workplace, it does not stop there for me. I take that with me where I go. I feel that in my body. It's not. I think this is perhaps something that folks who've been in a situation with a microaggression, or even has, if someone says, "Well, X did Y to me," you may say, "Well, it's a passing thing. Why can't you just digest it? Get over it." But it's not something that's easily digestible. And I think that's why I use violence, because in some ways the term violence captures the enormity of an action that could otherwise seem really simple, like really small, really, what's the word? Really just, but it's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm going to violence, right? Because it really holds that. It holds like the after and the before and the after. It holds the impact, and there's an impact issue here, right? It's not a small thing to go to our workplace day in and day out and face a microaggression. And even when you try to name it, there's a refusal. There's a refusal of admittance. There's a refusal to acknowledge. Then the refusal becomes an additional aspect of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So the things that I was thinking of, because again, my background is conflict resolution. Violence can be seen as the curtailing of human potential, right?
Okay,
So
I like that.
when actions happen, and we're talking about structural violence here too, like when there are structures in place that dictate human behavior but curtail it in a way such that somebody cannot fully be themselves, the fullest expression of themselves, they cannot then leverage that self for the maximum potential, right? And that might look, it appears in a myriad of ways, right? Which is what makes it so challenging. And again, if we're not considering individual people, then we won't get at their individual experience to understand how certain actions, certain behaviors, certain just structures kind of channeled them into becoming something that they maybe didn't necessarily want to become in the first place. On that cheery note, let's pivot to our next question. So as DEI professionals, right? In your view, how can we ensure that white people are on board with DEI efforts, even as we continue to examine and analyze the impact of whiteness in our society and more specifically our workplaces?
Am I jumping in on this one?
If you'd like to.
I think there's no simple answer to this, and I think, and I refuse the palatable, like the ease to digest, like simplicity. I I think this is an internal and an external. Like this is a question of an internal process and an external process, and a willingness to reckon with something that's internal, right?
Mhm.
When we're talking about whiteness, we're also talking about the way that folks have been socialized, racialized in society. We're talking about something that began at home, perhaps when you were 2, when you were 3. Kids see race as young as 2, 3 years old, and they start like understanding racial hierarchy as early in at that point in time as well. And so, as a white person, if you're not willing to sort of sit down and question yourself about this, then there is no amount of external anything that is going to do that work for you. And so I think this is one of the reasons why I say yes, external support. It can give you a resource, but there's also a commitment that is necessary, a willingness, an openness to self-evaluate and to do some of that work through reflection, through your own reading. Because again, right, a DEI practitioner cannot facilitate the. I mean, we're here to facilitate a journey, but there are also limits to what we're able to do. And I think that is an important aspect of this as well.
Yes.
Anybody else like to jump in here?
I'll share. I guess 2 things are, well, a main thing that's coming to mind is I've seen in my work, and this has been part of my personal experience, is that white people often get more on board, or there's kind of a they can be energized around seeing how whiteness actually doesn't work for us either, right? We're also harmed by whiteness. So for instance, in one avenue, we know that whiteness, a core of it is eugenics and sort of the ideal white person. So whiteness also very much excludes people with disabilities, even if you are white, right? Whiteness excludes poor white people, right? So there are ways in which if you hold a marginalized identity and you're white, whiteness is you're not enough, right? Under the system of oppression that is, or the system of dominance that is whiteness. So that's one way to look at it. Another way is just how it shows up in the workplace. And this is where it really kind of deepened my framework, was seeing how, Enrico, you talked about, the people being objects of production, right? So it's all about more, bigger, doing as much as possible, urgency, just overworking is our current, white supremacist capitalist system, that we're all cogs in the machine. And ultimately seeing how obviously there is violence towards BIPOC folks. And so I'm not trying to do, a comparison there, but I want to name how, as white people, when we are cogs in the machine, we are also harmed by that. So I really got awareness of that when I was working at an organization, and we were just all totally overworking, taking on as many clients as we could, all about the profit, right? And my partner and I both worked remotely. So we went to like a cabin in the woods to kind of work in a serene environment and be really calm, be among the trees. And I was trying to finish a deliverable for a client, and I hadn't had a panic attack in years. And I had a panic attack trying to get this thing done. And I was like, I'm in the woods. Like, why am I, And so just to be able to kind of take a step back and look at what I was doing and why, who is this for? And how is this actually harming the people? It was harming me and harming the people around me, especially BIPOC folks in my workplace, right? And that was kind of a pivotal moment for me of, really wanting to divest from whiteness and say, no, that's not how I operate anymore, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to be a part of it. This is not in alignment with my values. I don't want to be a cog in the machine or treat others like they are. I want to be a part of, everyone living their full humanity. And so I've seen it a little bit more, people kind of tapping into, oh, wow, like Dr. Webb said, looking at the history of how our workplace culture is grounded in, the way that plantations were set up, and am I just perpetuating the same thing that they were doing back then in how I'm showing up now? So that can be kind of helpful for folks to come in that way.
Yeah, Jess, that's like a horror movie setup, like in this nice cabin in the woods with your partner getting cozy. Who's that at the door? It's whiteness. Oh my God, like.
Thank
We've
you
got,
for the humor in that.
We've got a question here. Jeremy is here in the comments and he's asking, he says, my question, and I hope this comes out right. People make mistakes. There will be someone who brings whiteness out, maybe not even intentionally.
Mhm.
How do we keep the conversation focused on moving forward in a good direction, as opposed to a situation where other non white participants want to only focus on the whiteness coming up and not using it as learning? So I'm sensing in this question that element of stuckness, right? So, like, just because something rears up, like, yeah, we can react to it, but how do we make sure that we're actually turning that into a learning opportunity?
Can I ask one question? What
Yeah.
is forward in a good direction, quote unquote? What does this mean? Because I think we also have to recognize that under white supremacy, um, progress at any cost, and I think Jess
Yep.
was speaking to this, progress at any cost is highly valued, if not seen as the dominant way, the right way to move forward. And so for me, it's like moving forward, we're moving on, right? Progress, but also the good. And I think this also gets us back to the earlier for whom, good for whom. And I'm also curious here as to why the non-white participants want to keep the focus on whiteness. Like, do they see something here or within that formation that is still informing the conversation? What is the structure of the conversation? And I think and this gets us back to how do we structure space,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that enables conversation that is both critical and useful.
Yep.
And I think without those other contextual clues, it's hard to answer this question. It's hard to say, oh, hey, um, why won't they move forward? There's something else here that I think that's not being named. And I think without the narratives from the other participants, it's hard to name that. But when we're talking about constructing space, we're talking about constructing a space that a container, it's not even the space, it's a container for this conversation that is both welcoming and supportive. And I wonder, if that space, that container was already constructed. I wonder, how was this conversation being framed? What was the expectation of the conversation? Because it also seems that, Jeremy, you have an expectation of the conversation and where the conversation should go. And I'm not entirely sure if all of the participants in that conversation if they shared those expectations. So, were expectations set? Was there a community moment where there was a collective, a collective sort of 5 minute, hey, check in, but what about this conversation? What are these expectations? What are your expectations? What are my expectations? What do I desire? What do you desire? Because sometimes, because of our positionality, we're going to have very different desires around this conversation. And also, all of those things may not be able to come out in this one conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that then gets us back to the framing, right? If all of it cannot happen in this one conversation, do we then set up multiple conversations? How do we then create a structure that supports all participants in what they desire? And I think that also gets us back to talk, or that gets me back to questioning, is there a hierarchy within the workplace where all desires aren't equal? Does that then kind of indicate something else that's happening that's not being named? So I'm very curious about your question, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I
me
think you've hit
too.
on a lot of great things there, Dr. Webb. And one of the things that I'd like to bring in from the conflict field is when people are in conflict, you'll notice that sometimes one of the parties will kind of be stuck, right? They'll keep coming back to the same thing over and over and over again. And that can be infuriating, right? So if you're a mediator and you've been charged with driving towards a resolution or an agreement, especially within a set amount of time, then your instinct might be to push forward to get to that thing. But again, that would not actually be, you wouldn't actually be able to enforce that agreement then, because the agreement has to have buy-in from the parties, right?
Yeah.
And real buy-in, not just like tacit agreement, what have you. But the thing about stuckness is often people get stuck because they feel like something that's important to them is not being acknowledged. Right. And so it'll express itself in multiple ways, right? The mind will tie everything back to that. So one of the simplest things you can do when people are stuck might be to very gently just say, I've observed that in the last 10, 15 minutes, I've heard you use this phrase a lot, but I can't figure out why. Can you help me understand why that's so important to you? And they'll tell you. More than half the time, they will tell you. And, they might not stop telling you for a while, especially if they've been coming back to it over and over and over again. And if that's the case, your job is just to kind of sit back and listen, maybe take some notes, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that pop up to me about this too, Enrico, is that I've I've been in conversations and I've seen conversations like this about not having the proper framing and how it can easily go off the rails. That's why it's really important to have a really good facilitator who can not be unafraid to manage those things. But the couple of things that kind of come up in this question too, that I want to point out for us to be careful for, is intentionality. Right, the one thing that I used to see in um, community agreements that I used to be the one to like veto it is assume good intentions,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, no, this is not the space for that. We can't always assume good intentions, and attention doesn't mean anything against impact. And
Right.
so what I try to inform people when we do these spaces is that you may do something intentional, but you must address the impact here. When it happens, we must address it. So we don't want to move on from that. We want to address it, because what I typically had seen happen, and I've been in some of those before I started this work, is we have these real talks. Somebody who is part of the dominant majority gets sensitive and starts breaking down, and then the whole conversation shifts to
To
their
fulfill.
comfort. The other person and the other people in the room who have been hurt by what they unintentionally said, and that has not been rectified. They're still sitting there and nobody's paying attention to what they're dealing with. And there's an individual who had mentioned, like, you can't just shake that off. You can't shake those microaggressions and things off. It stays with you, right? And so we would be doing a disservice when holding these spaces if we are catering to one comfort over another, especially when we're aiming towards supposed to be facilitating and helping the marginalized community, but we're forgetting about them. And I always want to make sure that when we have these spaces, that and sometimes it's okay to stop. So that's part of the one thing about white supremacy culture is it's always like product over people, and also sense of urgency, the faster the better. And
Mhm.
so all those things we need to make sure that we're being cognizant of. There's like 13 white supremacy cultures that's been outlined. You can look it up. And to Dr. Webb's point, and also to Jess's point, there's a lot of them that just manifest in the workplace very easily. We have to check ourselves against those things too, because our mantra is first do no harm. And we need to make sure that we're protecting the communities that we're supposed to be serving. So when it comes to like building these like spaces, we need to always be cognizant of that and try not to be part of the problem.
Absolutely. So I see that we are coming close to the end of our time here, but I do want to ask, in your experience, how do you strike that balance between calling it like you see it and making sure that your businesses flourish?
I can start. I will just say, like, part of my framework in my work is having an abundance mindset, because whiteness thrives off of scarcity, right? It's all about competition. There's not enough, so you better get what you can get and kind of leave other people, push other people out of the way. And so in my work and sort of anti-racist work, and also in my personal healing work, I've tried to foster an abundance mindset. And so that helps me be like, you know what, if this relationship with this client, if it's not working, or if this client I can tell is not ready to do the work, I just trust there's other work that's going to come. Like, I don't need to kind of, I guess what I want to say is I'm not focused on like the dollar signs, right? I'm focused on doing effective work. And in terms of when I'm in a space with a client, calling it like I see it, I mean, I will say that that's something that I'm still in practice around, because I've had to do a lot of unlearning and a lot of healing around being conflict avoidant. That is so deeply ingrained in me. And I know that it's part of my conditioning as a white person, and specifically as a white woman, right? Like whiteness and patriarchy teach me to keep my mouth shut and to not engage in conflict. And so it's been a growing edge for me to be able to essentially, I just try to name what I'm observing, right? And just saying, this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I know from my experience, and this is what I'm offering, right? And I try to be a truth teller, but I will say that this is definitely, like I said, a learning edge for me.
That's good. I definitely subscribe to what you're saying as well, Jess. For me, that line is also like just setting the tone very first and foremost. And I do love what you mentioned about the abundance mindset. Like there are tons of clients out there. And here's the thing. I would love to see more of us team up. Like where's this partnership and communication and stuff, because there's there's no way that one individual knows everything about DEI. Is such a huge umbrella, and that's how we can start educating the masses and our clients and understanding that you might not necessarily just choose one practitioner in your journey. You're probably going to have many practitioners that you're going to be working with who specialize in different things, because as your organization grows and changes, your goals are going to change, your strategy is going to change, your needs are going to change. And you're going to need to reach out to other people who are specializing in other areas, and that's fine. And I don't worry about like, oh, I'm not going to get another business come my way. For me, it's important for me to have the right business come my way. And so because I need to be able to enjoy what I'm doing and know that I am getting work done. So I have my own standards as well to define whether or not I want to work with this client that's best for me and my health and my self-care. So I would say, and finally, I try to stay away from transactional behavior with my clients. This should be relationship. Like I said, people oriented work needs to be relationship. And so, just like any relationship, we try to align on some values, make sure that we're aligned on like what I'm there to do and what they need me to do. And then as our relationship grows, I start turning up the standard. Like we're learning together, you're unlearning. I'm going to be able to feel safer for you calling out some stuff. And the way I call it out might be a little different when we first meet. But then I bet by the time 6 months working with me, we're going to get very, very, very real together, and that's how we get like the real work done. So there's a little bit to be said that there's a little bit of psychology and a little bit of sociology that goes a long way in our work, let me tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jessica Bantam's weighing in and saying, we need each other to balance and tag team it in dealing with clients too. Yeah. Dr. Webb, would you like to jump in?
I agree with everything that has been said here. I think for me, I do try to, as Jess mentioned, stay away from scarcity models. And I think for me too, the question is, as Chloe said, I prefer it not be transactional, and I do want a deep, rich sort of experience for the organization and for myself. And I want to be able to facilitate in a way that is effective but also balanced. And so, I I do tend to step back when I spot major red flags, especially if I've named and I've said, "Hey, but these things are happening." But you know, if there seems to be a reluctance to sort of recognize that something is going on, to me that is a harbinger of what's to come, in that the work is not going to be effective. So for what I'm saying is, I think for me, it's about the boundaries that I hold as most important, and one of those is, or the main line for me is, if this is going to, back to those red flags, if this is if this is happening at the outset, then what is to come?
Right.
And am I endangering also your, because how could, if I don't feel that we're going to be able to communicate effectively and work effectively together, then I cannot support your employees effectively either. And I
Yep.
cannot help you to do effective work. And I think so for me, the boundary perhaps is like effectiveness, but also, if effectiveness, I think, is the boundary. And so, there are tests for that I have. And one of those is the communication. If I'm spotting things, even in just initial communication, um, maybe time to step back. But I do hold, right? Because the scarcity can be so terrifying.
Hmm.
Having to step back from that and say, oh, hey, you know what? If this one doesn't work out, they're as close at an abundance of clients. A lot of people need support.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I'd like to just emphasize that community aspect here, right? So if you are out there still watching and thinking, well, I'm a DEI professional and I do have to uh, revert to a scarcity mindset just to get the bills paid. This is not a shame on you. This
Mhm.
is like what we aspire to move into, right? And
Mhm.
so one of the ways that we can make that flow happen a little bit faster, a little bit better is to leverage community, right? So if you're out there like, I don't know what community to join, well, Diverity is a community that you could join for sure.
Mhm.
And the great thing about community is if you're in community and you're asking for help, well, that's what community's for. It'll help you to get a sense, it'll help you to check yourself, right? It'll be like, hey, I'm applying for this, I'm putting out this proposal, but I'm feeling unsure about this client. Could I get somebody to check my head, please? And more than half the time, somebody's definitely going to be willing to do that. They may have even been in the same situation, worked with a similar client, what have you. But the point is, if you're trying to take on diversity work alone, then that doesn't lean into the whole diversity thing, right? Like that's a singular point of view. So we can only do this work together. And yeah, it can be tough, especially when we got to like name certain things that might be uncomfortable for some of us, but that's just part of the reality, right? So up on screen here you can see that we're all different backgrounds and everything. No one of us has the same experience, but that's what collectively makes us powerful.
Yeah.
Any kind of closing thoughts here or shameless plugs, like anything that you want people to direct their attention to, or anything you're super excited about?
Mm.
No, I would just like to say that I love these type of conversations. I love that we get to talk about some of these topics, because not everybody has a space to do that in. Not everyone has space to feel comfortable talking about these things, and so I'm glad that we have this kind of space to pull those things together and discuss them. And hopefully, some of these nuggets get down to other folks who maybe had need some validation or a different way of looking at things. That's what all this is about. There was a TikTok the other day that I ran across that had mentioned that like every living creature has some instinctual protection that helps them from birth. It's like snakes know how to bite. Bees know how to sting. It's like for us, we cry for help.
Mm.
That is what we initially knew how to do. That's all that we could do is cry for help. And so I just tell people that think about that and try not to work in a silo because this could be very draining. And more like Enrico said, try to find a community of folks, even if you have to start small and group up with 3 or 4 of y'all. Hey, that's something, something that you can bounce ideas off of, someone that you can, connect with. But and don't be afraid to ask for help.
I think that's great advice.
I would just plug or say to any white folks that are listening that it's definitely been true for me that doing personal healing work is part of my anti-racist work. And so I encourage you to do that if you're not already. And for me, looking into the tenets of abolition and somatics and just kind of getting back connected to my body and how the values that I want to live out in this world have really been crucial for me, because I think we can spend a lot of time in our heads like trying to learn everything that we can learn about anti-racism. And for me, it's really pivotal to be in the body. Like, how am I actually showing up how am I living my life on a day-to-day basis, and doing that in both anti-racist spaces and, you know, with a therapist or whoever that is, that I'm getting support around, kind of, again, like divesting from those tenets of whiteness in the workplace.
Great. Thank you so much.
I think I just want to extend a profound thank you for this conversation. Thank you. I'm happy that we were able to do this. And if anyone would like to connect with me, please check me out on LinkedIn. Shameless
Yeah.
plug.
Yeah, same here. I'm always open to connect with people on LinkedIn.
Thank
Great.
you.
Well, thank you all so much, everybody, for tuning in. The engagement in the content, in the comments, excuse me, was really fantastic. Thank you again to all of our guests. That's Dr. Nadejda I, Webb, Clarissa Fuselier, and Jess MacFarlane. And if you're looking to hire any of our consultants, we are all for hire. So please just keep that in mind. Anyway, once again, this is Enrico Imanalo for the DEI is podcast. And just a gentle reminder, you are not alone. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, Enrico.